This is the third formal podcast that we're having with Conversations with Dr. D. Our first two were with Nicholas Lamp in the law school and then Stephen Mason, who is buying or trying to attempt to purchase the Trans Mountain Pipeline with Indigenous help and Indigenous financing. Our third one today is with Mr. Warren Kinsella, who, for those of us that have been around the Canadian political scene for a while, know that name for reasons that are about to become evident. And we're really excited to have him here, and his expertise and area he's going to talk about is the running of political campaigns, the political landscape in Canada, some commentary on some contemporary Canadian political issues, and then sort of what he sees going on in the body politics. So thank you, Warren. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks, Professor, for having me.
Great. Now, in preparation for this, we always ask people to send a bio from either themselves or an assistant sends one.
Right.
And quite often they're very long. Yours is surprisingly short, the what I got. Warren Kinsella, a lawyer, author. I downloaded your book last night, read through it, the War Room book. Author, political consultant, and commentator. He proudly was the special assistant to Jean Chretien and chair of 6 winning Liberal war rooms. So I got a grand total of 2 sentences in your bio. Would you care to elaborate on those 2 sentences and tell people who you are, what you've done, and what you're doing now?
Well, my background, I'm a lawyer, I confess, and I've been a journalist, and I've taught innocent youngsters how to be a journalist. But I think the thing that I've done that's most noteworthy is neither of those. In 1992 or so, do you want me to tell you kind of a little war room story, perhaps?
Well,
maybe
tell us what a war room is, and then tell a war room story.
Quick response, opposition research, targeted research, basically how it came to be. And I would love to say I invented the concept, but I did not. Around 1992, I was the special assistant to Jean Chrétien before he became prime minister. And in those days, when it was warm, like it is today, I used to love sitting on the Spark Street Mall, which ran in behind our offices on Parliament Hill. And I'd get a hot dog and read the New York Times. And I've been a New York Times nut for my whole life. And that summer, and we're coming up to this now in the United States because it's another presidential cycle. The Republicans were getting ready to renominate George Bush Sr. as their presidential nominee. And the Times was there, of course, at the Astrodome in Houston. And, this is the days before everybody had a cell phone and the days before the internet was a reality. So it was pretty primitive days. And in the Times coverage of the Republican convention, it's the first couple of days, it would start off further down in the news coverage and it moved further up as the days went along. What was happening was, Bush would be on stage, or Lee Atwater, or one of the Republican luminaries, and they'd say something or make a claim or what have you. And there was a Democratic Party unit at the convention. And so something extraordinary was happening. And I apologize for a long-winded answer to a short question. The Republicans would say something, and before they left the stage, a fax would come into the assembled media. There were many more media in those days, refuting what was said or mocking what was said with citations of research. And so over successive days in Houston, the coverage started to shift where the Democrats were getting much more into the coverage for what the Republicans expected to be a love-in. And that, of course, was the unit led by James Carville, and George Stephanopoulos, and Betsy Wright, and others. And so I was excited by this. I was electrified by it. It was like the hand of God touched me on the shoulder and said, pay attention to this. And so I got in touch with them. And that was, in fact, the war room in Little Rock that was working in Houston for the convention. And my background was journalism and law, and I was working for the leader of the opposition. And I decided we had to do this. And so I went to Mr. Chretien and said, we have to do this. And he said, no.
Okay, well, I think he changed his mind at some point. Why did he say no, and how did you change his mind?
It seemed risky to him, and it had never been done before in Canada. When you're doing opposition research and quick response, I mean, with quick response, as the name implies, you're moving fast, and there's a likelihood, or certainly a possibility, that some of your war room are going to lose a limb. A mistake gets made. Mm-hmm. But the old days of running a political campaign were gone. At that point in 1992, News World had been, this around-the-clock news channel on CBC was operating. You had C-SPAN in the United States and CNN. So the media atom had broken. Everything had changed. In the old days, you could take Jeffrey Simpson from the Globe and Mail out for lunch and spin him and give him your story. And a couple of days later, a column that would hopefully conform to your spin would show up. And basically what the Little Rock people and then me were asserting was that had changed. The paradigm had shifted. And this was before the internet. Because of these TV news channels, everything was faster. So the news cycle had sped up dramatically. And I said to Chrétien, we have to do this or we're doomed. And, that summer, coming up to that summer, Kim Campbell looked like she was going to become the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. And I know it's easy to dismiss her now, but, on the Canada Day weekend, after she won the leadership of her party, she was the most popular prime minister in the history of Poland, right? She went, remember that tour she did from Newfoundland all the way to BC in a single day on Canada Day.
First Canadian prime minister, female. Yeah.
It had it all. And so our caucus was freaking out. But, I had been working with some of my colleagues. There were only about 6 of us. I had Kim Campbell. I knew everything that she had said since high school. We had researched all. Another guy had Jean Chretien. Somebody else had Jim Edwards, Pierre Mbidi, what have you. So it was targeted research. So we didn't know who was going to become conservative leader. It turned out it was my candidate. And so our caucus were freaking out about the polls. Mr. Chrétien came out, not quite yet, but, his famous scrum where he said the nervous Nellies needed to calm down. I went to see him at Stornoway with my war room research on Kim Campbell. And he just sat there and went through it and then handed it back to me. And he said, thank you, young man. So at that point, I think he saw what the value was of the war room approach, which is quick response for sure, but scrupulously researched material on your opponent or on your own candidate, right? Know your own vulnerabilities. And we got to work. And, it had never been done before. There were a couple innovations we had. We actually had a precursor of the internet. We had a digital line, it cost us a fortune, set up across the country. So I could know, for example, what the supper time or the 11 o'clock newscast would be on BCTV in Vancouver. So I would have a digital version of that. So that was in advance of the internet. It cost us a lot of money, but it was worth it. And basically what we did is every misstep, everything that she did wrong, or every contradiction or whatever, we would respond quickly, and in some cases, in kind of a mean way, based upon research and making sure that it was always accurate. And what happens in that paradigm, and Carville and Stephanopoulos had told me this, reporters become addicted to it. If they form the view that you have reliable information, they will rely upon it because you can move more quickly than their own research methodologies permit. And, some people tell me we won the election. I don't think that's the case, but I think we played a role in the victory that we had in 1993.
Well, a couple of things I've built up on that. First of all, this is 30 years ago. Sometimes I look now, for example, I see the State of the Union address in the United States, and people have their responses to the State of the Union, and they give them immediately after, which gives kind of a prefabricated feel to it. But the speeding up of the political process and not the process, but the response to what is going on in campaigns has been going on for 30 years. It's not new, and it's only getting worse. Well, it's getting more intense, it would seem. And even though Chrétien may at the time, who was our prime minister, he's very long experience, he saw the value very quickly about what you were doing and gave you the freedom to do it. Is that correct?
He did, but he gave me an editor. So I set up a war room in kind of a newsroom format because I had a background as a journalist at the Calgary Herald and at the Ottawa Citizen. So, there was an editorial side, the researchers who were generating information on the candidates and the issues and so on. But the other side was the writers' side, the communicators. So I had people who were able to put together graphics quickly. I had people who could write quickly. They would either do everything from a quick press release to preparing speaking notes for Mr. Chrétien or one of our candidates. So it had that kind of structure, and Chrétien came to depend upon it. And I'd love to claim credit for having invented it in Canada. I did not. I just brought to Canada a model of it for the first time that had already been in use for a year in the United States.
Now, did you always want to do this line of work? I mean, you've got a varied background. How did you kind of decide this was where you were going to put your time and effort?
That's a good question. I think, in political campaigns, you'll get people, some who are great at qualitative or quantitative research. You'll get some who are great at doing policy work and so on. I had felt for some time, and I think it was my background as a reporter, I'd been a police reporter, persuaded me that things were speeding up because of the very technology that we're speaking on now. It hadn't been developed yet, but it was on the way. And, the old paradigm, the old way of doing politics, I said to Chrétien, look, the media are changing. If we do not change, if we're not congruent to what they are doing, we're going to lose. Like we're just going to be out of the story. And, so that's what we did. We adapted in a way that the conservative government did not. They were kind of old-fashioned in their approach to the campaign, and it just didn't work because of News World and then later on CTV News Channel and so on. Everything was different. So what has happened in the interim, the 30 years, as you point out, the paradigm is the same. Everything's sped up, but it's just even faster. Mm-hmm. So because of social media, Threads, landing last night, Threads is going to change campaigns. Twitter before it, Facebook, et cetera, YouTube, all of these, there's always as I say to my war room staff, there's a new technology every campaign. I really don't give a damn what it is. We just have to make use of it where the greatest audience exists, or the gettable audience that we're after.
Well, and also today, I'm just thinking this on the way down, creates a digital record for anybody who ever runs for office, has got everything they've done since they were 12 is potentially findable by people running war rooms.
Yeah, that's what I say to my kids. Be careful, because the internet is forever, and guys like me can find anything. If you have a misstep, it lives forever in Google. And it astounds me still that in campaigns, a good half of the activity within any campaign, nationally or regionally at this point, is still catching people on stupid things they said or did on social media. And, and then this dance commences, do they get rid of the candidate? Do they hold on to the candidate, et cetera? So that's why I said to you a few minutes ago, yes, we do research what our opponent has said, votes and quotes, as I put it. But we also research our own candidate. A good war room has to know the vulnerabilities of their candidate, what he or she has said that is unhelpful to their cause.
Now, a couple of things about that, and I'm reading through the verbiage you use in your book is deliberately drawn. It is drawn from military stuff. It's a war room. All right. And one of the quotes I saw in the book was my spineless group of political assassins. Not spineless wasn't the right word. Something along this nature. I mean, the verbiage of it is it's competitive and tough. And you also talk a little bit about people who claim they don't like it, but they really do, in terms of the toughness of it. And I got a comment about that. I'm kind of curious about that. Would you use that same verbiage today?
Yeah, for sure I would. And I give speeches to that effect. My firm does public opinion research. I've certainly read a lot of it over the years, but it's kind of absurd to say to people, do you like negative campaigning? It's like asking them if they like death. Of course, they're going to say, no, they don't like it. Right. It's an answer dictating a question dictating what the answer is. But, in my books, I liken it to a car crash, because I knew this from when I was a cop reporter, during law school. I'd be sent out on the weekends to cover car crashes in Calgary. And if they were sufficiently dramatic, we'd put them in the paper. And inevitably, we would get people phoning in to say they were going to cancel their subscription because we were ghouls and so on. They would never cancel their subscription. But what I observed when I was out there is every single car would slow down to take a look at the crash.
Yeah.
He would look away. They would look at the crash. And so that, what underlies that, it's a simplistic example, but it's not no less true for that. The negative stuff, the stuff that political parties do, if we could run ads of, kids running through a field of flowers and have it be effective, we would do that, right? It'd actually be cheaper than what we do. But the hard hitting stuff, the stuff that's critical of the public record, not the personal record of our opponents, that is the stuff that is compelling, and it is the stuff that people remember, and it affects the vote choices that they make.
Well, there's two comments I'll raise to that. I mean, people like me who work in universities, what do we say to ourselves? Man, if I was running things, I really would know what to do. But they drop the part about winning an election. They don't know about how to do that. But a really intriguing thing you said earlier was the division between private and public, and I'll outline what I mean. There's another Canadian who's made the same argument you just made about a different field. His name's Don Cherry. Mm-hmm. Right, and his argument was people don't like fighting in hockey, but nobody ever, if there's one in the game, everybody watches. So they're kind of lying to themselves. They kind of do. But there's also this honor thing. And in hockey, there's one, right? There's the enforcer code. You don't fight there's times when you fight, times when you don't. There's ways you do it. Like there's rules around it. And I sort of sense from yours that while you might fight tough, there is a code of some kind. There's some things that are off limits. Some you back it with facts. This is their public life. A, is that true? And B, is that eroding a little bit in this age of social media where it seems like everything anyone does is wide open for attack? I don't know. I want to get your thoughts on those.
No, it's an important question. Because occasionally I'll get a young person in the campaign. I'll be specific, when I was advising Michael Ignatieff before he had the big expulsion of his aides. I wasn't one of them, but I left because I could see the writing on the wall. One of them came in and he had a police report. And the police report detailed Jack Layton, who was then alive, being caught in what's called, a rub and tug. So a massage place that has a sexual dimension. So I handed it back to this assistant, who I won't name. And I said, yep, so? And he said, well, we should use this. The NDP is becoming a threat for us. And I said to him, number one, we're not going to use that under any circumstances whatsoever. And number two, if I see it show up somewhere, I'll know that it was you who did it, and I'll make sure that you never work in politics again. And the reason why I felt strongly about it then, as I do now, is that stuff doesn't work. That police report did come out in 2011, just before the vote in 2011. And Jack Layton, people looked at it, they considered it, and they made him, for the first time in the history of the NDP, the leader of the opposition. So that, to me, is a fairly recent and notorious example of digging into somebody's private life, their personal life. People disapprove of it. Clinton, and after Lewinsky, and he gets impeached in the House of Representatives. And what happens? Polling shows he's the most popular president in the history of polling up until that point. It doesn't work. What matters, as I said, is votes and quotes and things that are on the public record. The expenditures they make, the statements they make, the decisions they make as people who will hold high public office. That matters. If you get into somebody's personal life, you are going to regret it. There are exceptions to that. For example, when Pat Buchanan, and he was on his path outside of sanity, but he was seeking the Republican nomination some years ago, and he had a Made in American campaign, much like Trump later did. And the war room, the George Bush Sr. war room, found out that he drove a Mercedes. And, they decided, well, this is personal. This is him personally doing this. But it exposed that his public position on, manufacturing in the United States was a lot of hooey. So, that would be one of the few examples where somebody's personal life is relevant to their public pronouncements. But I very strongly feel no war room should get ever into the personal stuff. It doesn't work. It's inappropriate, and voters don't like it.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that is being thrown at in U.S. politics, and a little bit in Canada, is this polished liberal elite thing where these politicians appear perfect and say everything robotically. And I'm wondering if the flaws that one sees, even in an extreme example like Donald Trump, but he looks like us, he acts like us, he says the way we are. And to attack him for those things actually boosts his popularity because people see in him themselves and they like it.
Yeah, no, I strongly agree. I mean, look, I worked for Jean Chretien, and he had Bell's palsy, a facial paralysis, and he communicated with broken English and broken French. We used to joke he didn't speak either official language. And but he and Mel Lastman and Ralph Klein and René Lévesque, to me, the politicians I like working for are the politicians who are regular schmoes, who look like a guy you can, the cliche you can picture having a beer with. The candidates who do poorly, particularly in the age of television, are the ones who look like matinee idols, who just are genetically perfect, like Kerry or what have you. They don't. There's no relatability. So the candidates that I prefer are the ones that are human. Rob Ford's another example. Doug Ford's another example, where people feel they're much more willing to give them a break for their mistakes, for their votes and quotes that went wrong. People are much more willing to look the other way with candidates like that.
Well, and we're seeing it across the board, and you've seen it for your career. Now, there's another thing you said to me, and this is my last question before we start getting into some contemporary stuff. You had a principle that we would not attack a person's private life. And even today, you, from what I can understand, have been a liberal in a long time, but you're not afraid to go after the Liberal Party when it's doing something you think they shouldn't do. It sounds to me like you had a bunch of principles well developed that you stick to first, and then you do the work. Where did you get them, and how does a young person develop them to know about what principles are going to matter to them if they decide to enter public life?
The thing I say to them, and I'm sure you experience this too with the kids who come see you, I have young people come to me all the time, and they want to get involved in public life, or they want to get into politics. And I don't care what their political stripe is. I mean, obviously, if they're a racist or something, I send them away. Mm-hmm. But what I say to them is you have to have a passion. You have to have a belief, something that an issue, a candidate that propels you forward. In my case with Mr. Chretien, I was a young lawyer, and the Meech Lake Accord had been pronounced, and basically it sought to impose an interpretive clause in the Constitution of Canada without any debate, without any discussion amongst us, the people. I objected to that. The only politician who agreed with me right then, because it was consensus across the board, all of the premiers, mostly all of the political leaders federally, had signed on to the Meech Lake Accord. And I needed a guy, and it turned out I wasn't alone, who felt the same way. That was Jean Chrétien. And so working for him as a volunteer, I was not a high-paid political operative or anything like that. I volunteered for him along with my legal practice. And then he brought me on to be a member of his staff. Young people getting involved in politics, you shouldn't be looking for fame. You shouldn't be looking for fortune. You have to find a candidate who excites you and makes you has the same belief system that you do, because then when you're working for that person, it doesn't feel like work at all. It feels like you're changing the world. So that is critically important. And then, the other part of your question is about how to maintain your soul, I guess, because in politics, it's really easy to start trading away your soul in little bits and pieces.
That's true. Yeah.
In democracy, it's a fact, and appropriately so. You can't win every argument. That's not the essence of democracy. For example, I disagreed with Chrétien on China. I didn't feel we should be having any truck or trade with human rights abusers, whether they're in Cuba or China or what have you. He was the prime minister, however, so that was, the decision that he made. It's the one thing I'd caution against is, so those types of accommodations will take place when you're working for your candidate. They will not be perfect, but you've just got to be very wary. You've got to be cognizant that you're not trading away too much of yourself. You have to be able to be prepared to say, look, this is not something with which I agree. And, I'm going to step back. I'm going to resign from the campaign or something. Unfortunately, in Canadian politics at this time, that doesn't happen very much. Michael Chong did it in the Harper cabinet. He disagreed with some decisions that were made. I can't think of a single instance of it happening with the Trudeau government. I guess Jody Wilson-Raybould would be one example, but it's pretty rare these days, and that's regrettable. And I think that's one of the reasons why people have moved away from democratic institutions, is they don't see anybody having a core belief about the way our democracy should be conducted.
Well, 2 points on that. One of the things I read in your book, that you don't much care for the tobacco industry.
I do not.
And we do a case in one of my courses on the tobacco industry. And one of the things students often ask me is, how is it a tobacco executive, once you know your product is killing people by the millions, how can you keep working for these folks? And I tell them, they didn't get there overnight. They come out of university, they take a job, and all of a sudden they got a wife and kids, and they got a house, and now they got stock options, and they traded away a little bit over years. It's not like they woke up one day and decided to do this. It sounds like this is something you just sort of said, was that you got to have a core, but you may have to trade the edges, but there's got to be a limit. And the second thing you also talked a little bit about is there seems to be about a numbness today in the political debate. I mean, we'll talk about this I have this listed at the end. I'm just raising it now. But the Trudeau government seems to have it's called the Teflon government. They've had a lot of things happen that people in previous areas might have been a bit more upset about it than they appear to be now. They appear to be, they just say, it just happened, Is that something you're seeing a little bit?
Yeah, no, I am. But it's not just unique to the Trudeau guys, in fairness.
No.
It's happening across the board. And I think the reason for that, the people to blame for that, are those of us who work in politics and those of us who work in journalism, and I've done both. We have a tendency in the political realm and the journalist realm to scream scandal way too often. It's classic boy who cried wolf. So we assign the scandal appellation to just about every damn thing that happens. And what's happened with the public is they've heard the allegations so many times, they now tune it out. And, until they see somebody led away in an orange pantsuit and handcuffs, they're just not paying attention. And the most perfect example of that is Donald J. Trump. The leading Republican nominee for the president of the United States is a guy who's under indictment twice for serious issues.
Yeah.
Not only has it not hurt him, there's research to show that it's probably helped him.
Mm-hmm.
That should tell you the public, my answer to your question is they just don't believe in scandal anymore. They've tuned it out. So that's why, getting back to my Jack Layton example, this young guy who brought in the police report, I said, it's not going to work.
No.
It's inappropriate. It's unethical. It's not going to work. And we have to make our case in a different way. And that's the stuff that people pay attention to still. But the scandal mongering, it has, I think the last time a scandal really had an impact on the body politic was Watergate. Forced out of president of the United States.
Late 70s.
Subsequently, Clinton has Lewinsky, becomes popular. Mm-hmm. Trump indicted, he's becoming the nominee. And Trudeau, has been found, he's the first sitting prime minister to have been found to have violated a federal statute twice. And he's still competitive. He may not win a majority, but he's still competitive. So the scandal stuff just doesn't work.
Well, another word that I would use in addition to scandal is crises. I think young people, and this is my observation, are crises out. We've had the race crisis, the climate crisis, the housing crisis, the fentanyl crisis, the immigration. I mean, it just on and on and on. And they're exposed to it day after day, hour after hour through their phones. I think young people, I think generally are numb. Like they've just seen so much of it and nothing really shocks them. And they're just want to go look at Netflix.
Yeah, there's an American writer who I'm a big fan of. He's a Democrat, but David Schenk is his name, Schenk. And the phrase he assigned to what you're describing is data smog. So, in the old days, let's say when I was starting the War Room in 92, information was like caviar. Like it was hard to get and it was sought after. Now it is like potatoes, right? It's easy to get because of Google, because of these things. Mm-hmm. Everybody's got a portable computer in their pocket. And so what Schenk argues is, before people have breakfast, they are being bombarded by hundreds of thousands of words and images every single day. It's too much information. So what they have a tendency to do, this data smog, is they just filter it out. They don't pay any attention to it. And this is why it's gotten so hard and so expensive for political parties to reach people. It's because they're just not paying attention to politics. I mean, you look at Toronto, effectively it was 120,000 people in a city of 3 million who decided who the next mayor should be, who has more power and a bigger budget than most provincial premiers. So it has having a corrosive effect on our democracy, the social media stuff and the internet stuff, not just because of how horrible people are to each other, but also because there's just too much stuff going on all the time and people have tuned it out.
Or at least I've seen the research is they tend to feed back to the same old sources that they've always used. They'll choose one or two. The big one in the States is the Fox people and the MSNBC people, and they just look at the same ones and they live in their own rabbit holes. We thought this information's capacity in a phone would make wiser, more informed, intelligent people, and it seems to have made the opposite, less informed in some ways, but certainly less caring or less involved.
Yeah, and we saw that in the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
There used to be a social consensus, is whether you were a conservative voter or a liberal voter or a New Democrat, all of us would gather around the TV set and watch Knowlton Nash every night.
Yeah.
He would dispassionately, more or less, relate the day's events, and then we would analyze that according to our own biases and prejudices. That's normal. what's happened is now there's a conservative Knowlton Nash and a liberal Knowlton Nash and a new Democrat Knowlton Nash, and there's a conspiracy theorist Knowlton Nash. So whereas news and political information used to be horizontal, it has now become verticals. It's become silos. And so the danger of that we saw in the pandemic. And one of their number is now in second place to Joe Biden for the Democratic nomination, Bobby Kennedy, who I was a friend and who I've worked with on campaigns. He's lost his mind, I think. And, he advances lies about the pandemic and the COVID virus. And how did that happen during the pandemic? How that happened, and it was a struggle for everybody from Doug Ford to Justin Trudeau, is a consensus among experts broke down. So because every doctor and nurse and professor had access to their own Twitter account and Facebook account, they started disagreeing in public.
Yeah.
Right. And so the social consensus about vaccines, I'd say to people, you've got a measles and polio vaccine. You got it when you were a baby. You've already been vaccinated. But when you had Fauci on one hand and Bobby Kennedy on the other, people would line up behind whatever vertical conformed to their own beliefs. And that is so dangerous. And you're seeing the problem that has created for political parties is there's no consensus anymore on a lot of issues. And so political parties have had to spend money doing micro-targeting and geodemographic targeting, where they're just kind of micro-targeting on voters because the broader messages don't work like they used to.
Well, and there's been what I call one of the books I'm contemplating writing but haven't done yet is what I call the breakdown of trust.
Yeah.
Everywhere. People don't trust professors. Like, are you really the expert? People don't trust the experts on TV. People don't trust the CDC. They don't trust the RCMP. They don't trust, it's so easy to throw darts at an organization's failures because they all have them because they're human and they make them. Yep. And then people say that because they made a problem in X, the whole thing should be discounted. That seems to me enormously corrosive across the board. I don't care what political or economic, or they don't trust companies either. Their basic thing is, we think you're lying to us before we even talk to you.
Yeah. And there are people who have made fortunes pushing the notion that there are no trustworthy institutions left in society. And, where I saw this first, before I got involved in politics, when I was a reporter at the Calgary Herald and later at the Ottawa Citizen, I did a lot of work on the racist right. So Holocaust deniers, Hitler freaks, white supremacies. That was my main focus some years ago, more than 30 years ago. And that methodology, if I can call it that, you describe, I first encountered when I'd interviewed Jim Keegstra or Ernst Zundel or some neo-Nazi. And I'd say to them, at all relevant times, Christ was a Jew. And then I remember I did that with Terry Long. He was the high Aryan warrior priest of the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, which was a terrorist group, mainly in Western Canada and Western United States. And Long ran into his living room and came back with a Bible. And he said, no, you're wrong. They had developed their own Bible. Christ was no longer Jewish. He was against the Jews, and he was a violent individual. So this is why it's so difficult to argue against some of these people now, is because they have their own points of reference. So there's no commonality. You can provide as much research as you like. You can be blue in the face providing research, and they just discount it. And we saw that on a wide scale during the pandemic, where, we just point out to people, vaccines work. They've worked for 100 years. They've saved millions of lives. Vaccines work. And they say, no, the COVID vaccine will kill me. Based upon what they saw on the internet somewhere.
I've seen this exact thing. It's the capacity. Well, if I don't trust anybody in the established mechanisms of truth, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to construct my own. I'm going to write my own Bible. I'm going to write my own rules of physics. I mean, people are able to do this with a degree I never anticipated. I'll talk a bit more about that at the end, because I want to see how we manage a political process that manages these sorts of things. If it's all right with you, I'd like to move us now towards some things that are going on right now in the Canadian body politic. There's three I sort of sent towards Tara, who is your assistant: Bill C-11, Bill C-18, and the concern of Chinese interference in the Canadian political process.
Yep.
We can start with any one of those. I'd like to hear your views and maybe have discussion about them. We can begin with whatever one you'd like, because I know you're active on Twitter on all of them. So which one would you like to begin with?
Well, the Chinese interference one is very important, and I feel it's a failure we've had as a country. I mean, all of the opposition parties have sought to make it an issue, even though all of the parties have admitted that they may have benefited from China's interference in their nomination processes and elections. I think this one is particularly corrosive to our country, because I worked for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and I worked for her in 3 different states, including her headquarters in Brooklyn. And the point when I arrived in Brooklyn, the leak to WikiLeaks had already happened, facilitated by the Russians, as everybody now knows. But, the United States, even after Trump became president, took that seriously. And one of his nominees to the Department of Justice launched what became the Mueller probe. 2 years, FBI agents, an army of lawyers, investigators, they took Russian interference in the 2016 presidential campaign very seriously. And it concluded, probably to Trump's surprise, that he was not personally culpable. He was a beneficiary, but he was not personally culpable. How, the Trump America can investigate that example of foreign interference in their democratic process, and we cannot do that when we've had it happen in 2 elections, in 2019 and 2021, is shameful. And, I think the Trudeau guys are getting away with it, excuse me, because they've done public opinion research showing it's not a preoccupation of many of their voters, the committed liberal vote. And I think they're making a mistake. But, Trudeau is still ragging the puck. As of this morning, saying, there's no consensus between the political parties on a public inquiry, and we're going to have to deliberate more. It's just so dangerous for our democracy, because what we're doing is casting into doubt all of our election process, which is at the lifeblood of our democracy.
So who's making the mistake? Is it the voters who don't care, or Trudeau who thinks, I don't care that they don't care, we should care, it's sort of thing? Like who? I mean, part of the art of political leadership is sometimes you go chase something down because you have to, even though it may not win you some political points.
Yeah.
So what's going on here? And now
I think it's Trudeau's guys have made a calculation that they can rag the puck and they can get through it, and they may. Right. The issue, we've got this extraordinary situation where you have CSIS agents, our intelligence agency, directly leaking stories to guys like me in the news media. Like, it's just unprecedented. And it's got to make our allies around the world very nervous, I'll tell you. But they're doing that because the Trudeau guys are not taking the issue seriously and not holding a public inquiry. This is where I think the Trudeau guys have made the biggest mistake. Is the leakers at CSIS, I believe it's more than one, are going to say, okay, well, then we're going to continue to provide evidence to the news media to push this issue forward. And, it's the death by 1,000 cuts. It's never one thing in politics that gets you. And this gets back to what we were talking about earlier about scandals. It's a confluence of events and issues where it's just a whole bunch of little cuts. And this is an example of that, where, there's just a body of evidence building in the media through these leaks that China did indeed interfere in our democracy at multiple levels, not just the federal, but also provincial and municipal, even school boards. So, I think he's whistling past the graveyard, because I think tomorrow morning there could be a story in Global or the Globe and Mail detailing more foreign interference, and the pressure will build on Trudeau anew.
Well, you made the quote in your book, if I remember, the grave is dug with tiny shovels.
Indeed.
And but this is a big shovel. I mean, and in the sense that what I understand that China has been doing this for a while. It's not as if this just sort of happened over the last election cycle and others. And that B, if I get this right, either if I read the newspapers correctly, the senior officials in the Canadian government weren't informed by their staff that it was going on, or B, were informed and decided to do nothing. Now, either one of those to me is pretty scary. Like, what is more important on your CSIS agenda other than this, if you aren't going to tell your senior people about it? And if you did and they didn't do anything, yeah, I mean, it's I'm sorry, you're the one supposed to be talking here, but this one bothers me a lot too.
No, and I'm with you. And, I'm not Pollyanna. I don't think that, do countries interfere in other countries' affairs? Yes, they've been doing that since Jesus was a little fellow. That's not new. But this was highly sophisticated, as you point out, over a period of years and multiple levels of government involving multiple individuals in multiple political parties. It was a concerted and very directed effort against a member of the G7. So what's been the consequence of it is when the Five Eyes, when national security and national defense exercises are taking place now in the past 18 months or so, the Americans and the Brits and the Australians are not inviting us. We've been excluded. And I think it's because they've formed the view that we're not taking seriously this issue. And, and I understand Trudeau's reluctance at one level. This was the guy who said in 2013, he has some admiration for the basic dictatorship in China, which of course is an outrageous thing to say. But, I think he decided the way he would offset the manifest destiny, the American influence, was by creating a more positive relationship with China. I understand that. That's politics. But he miscalculated with Xi. And, Xi is a thug and a bully and a profoundly dishonest person. And that's not a regime with which we should be aligned. And so, I think Trudeau's made a miscalculation there. And he's now attempting to recalibrate. He's being much more critical in the past 6 months of the Chinese regime. And the other thing that's important to add here, the target, the nefarious things that have happened, the damaging things that have happened, have had less effect perhaps on guys like you and me. But for members of the Chinese Canadian diaspora, it's had a profound effect on them, right? And, we owe it to them to be dealing with this issue, and we're not doing so. So I think ultimately Trudeau will have to capitulate, but boy, he's sure dragging his feet.
Well, it's interesting that, you mentioned the word bully, and that's not a bad word for sure. But the way you stand up to bullies is with a group of people who united say, we're not going to take this, because it would be very strange for me to believe that Canada was the only country that China was doing this to, and that we're that important, that there's probably a concerted effort across a number of countries, and that the idea is to be reunited against it collectively. And we had a NATO exercise about a couple of weeks ago that we weren't invited to, and there's this worry about not spending 2% of our money on defense that keeps coming up. So there is this international standing business that is a bit of a concern.
No, it's important. And, our reputation, we're never going to have the military might of the United States. We're never going to have the diplomatic influence of the Brits, or the French. But, you know, going back to Pearson, we did have a reputation internationally that was important, you know, and going up to Chretien, you know, leading his Team Canada efforts abroad. And Harper wasn't so bad internationally either. And it's just, you know, this guy, I think, Trudeau has made the decision that international affairs, he is going to remake it. And I understand that, but some prime ministers and presidents do that all the time as a legacy piece. But he's just made some bad calculations. And this is the most extreme example of that. The Xi regime in China is not our friend. They've demonstrated that. They have a total they kidnapped two of our citizens who are completely innocent and illegally imprisoned them for years. Like, you know, that is not a regime with which we should be regarding as a normal trading partner. To me, the solution for it is trade. You know, China has acquired that might internationally because all of us have gone along with them building up their manufacturing base at our expense. You know, everything that you and I are speaking on at the moment, without a doubt, has been made in China. And, you know, so that's created a weakness. And I think we need to be looking seriously at shifting some of our manufacturing base to India and Vietnam and so on. I think that's underway, but China still has that grip on our manufactured goods internationally.
Well, it's certainly been made aware us in Canada and the United States about the reshoring, the friendshoring, Biden doing the CHIPS Act and Inflation Reduction Act, all about national industrial policy. Let's talk a little bit about these C11 and C18. Now, C18 is the bill, just for our listeners, that will force the big social media platforms, and I'm doing this best I can, to pay money to our media outlets in order to refer their websites. And is that your understanding of it? And
no, I would say that's not accurate. Yeah. C18, and you know, this is one of those instances where I have actually applauded what the Trudeau guys did, because my undergraduate degree, my background is in journalism. Google and Facebook have been, and stealing the intellectual property of guys like me for years, and without compensating us. And that's not fair, and that's not right. So what Australia and the Austrians and now the United States and now Canada have said is, look, guys, you've made yourselves into companies that have a GDP larger than most countries in the world, Facebook and Google. And you've done that in part by a little bit of thievery. You've taken the intellectual property of journalists, you've repurposed it and changed it a bit so there'd be no copyright attaching to it, and you presented it as your own. And so what C18 does...
I didn't know they were doing that. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, just look at Apple News. You know, you'll find a Warren Kinsella column on there, but it doesn't look like it did in the Toronto Sun. They've changed the look of it. Unfortunately, there's no copyright in news. There's copyright in the presentation of news. And so... Google and Facebook have benefited tremendously, but C18 doesn't force them to compensate news organizations. What it does is it obliges them to enter into negotiations with news organizations, large and small. Mm-hmm. And so it compels a discussion, and the parties are left to work out the compensation themselves. There's an arbitration mechanism within it if they can't reach agreement. But in the Australian example, they've never had to use the arbitration, is my understanding. So, Google, I think, is backing away from its threat to censor Canadian news content. They've said, and I think this is reasonable, I think Google has said, we want a cap on our liability. Let's say it's $250 million. We want a cap on our liability. I think, I understand capitalism. They don't want it to be unlimited. So that's fair. And, $250 million sounds like a reasonable figure. What Facebook is doing is not fair. Facebook is just saying, no way, Jose, we don't give a sweet damn what your legislatures have done. our view is going to prevail, and we're going to basically beat you into submission. They did that in Australia for a week, and then they capitulated. They stopped doing that. They did it in Spain for 7 years, and that wasn't good for Spanish democracy. So I don't know how this one's going to end up, but because news organizations like the one I write for are in such precarious economic circumstances, if this thing doesn't get fixed by the end of August, I think you're going to see a lot of newspapers disappearing.
Well, that's where I was also going with it. I mean, I don't know, our viewers may not know this, but it takes money and resources to produce quality news, right? You got to have bureaus, you got to have reporters, you got to have editors, you've got to have, and that business has been leaking profitability, for a decade and a half now, and it's becoming increasingly harder to do this. So the sense that things should be free that are not free to produce, like quality news, I think there should be a pushback on that. It's true on a lot of fronts. Otherwise, you are. I mean, how are we doing on the news front? It sounds to me most of them are pretty tight. Like, it's very tough, losing reporters and losing profitability all over the place.
Well, an analog is the music business. One of my books is about the music business, punk rock, which I know a lot about. I've been in bands since I was a teenager. And I interviewed Johnny Rotten once, and we were talking about this. And, I said, well, how do you feel about Napster, as it then was, or these organizations that are digitizing your stuff and circulating it to people for free? And he said, well, how would you feel if I came into your living room and took your TV, your couch, and all your chairs? Right. He said, that's what they're doing. And, in some real senses, it's destroyed the music business. This is why you see bands touring now, because they have no other way to achieve income, because a whole generation now has grown up believing that they can steal music. And it's the same thing. News people, journalists and editors did this to themselves. When the internet came along, we reacted in exactly the wrong way. We started giving away our product for free. Newspapers on subways, and things like that. And our websites were open. So, people, it's logical. People would say, well, why the hell do you want me to pay for it now? You've been giving it to me for 3 years. So we devalued our own product. And that's a cultural shift that I think is going to be very difficult to surmount. This is why I think all governments around the world, democratic governments, are saying, Google and Facebook, you got to be fair, right? You guys have been profiting on the work of others, and you've got to make some reasonable return to these organizations.
Yeah, the line I read this morning was something like, their opposition to this bill was, well, that's not how the internet works. That's not the model. But the model's changeable, right?
That's right. No, it's I don't know where this is going to go, but it gets back to what we were talking about earlier. Just as the internet and these internet platforms have changed political campaigns and our democracy, they've also changed journalism. And I was with a cabinet minister, one of Ford's ministers, on the weekend at a Canada Day thing. He's a very nice guy. And he was asking me about the Google and Facebook fight. And I said, well, get ready, because you are going to have your next campaign covered by guys living in their mother's basement who have no regard for factual content or balance or fairness. Those are the people who are going to be covering the campaign. If guys like us, if we disappear, that's what you're going to be contending with. And that is really bad for democracy. We saw that in the Clinton-Lewinsky case. The Lewinsky story was not broken by any mainstream news organization. Nobody would touch it. It was the Drudge Report. A website broke it, and then everybody felt compelled to cover it at that point. So, that's the danger of some of the content that shows up on the internet, is a lot of the time it's not true. It's lies. And people go off chasing it, and it gives them a warped view of, our public affairs.
But it's being produced in such a way as to garner attention. That's one of the problems we all are struggling with is the attention deficit of people, the desire for them to look at this podcast and not somebody else's, and why would they do that? And so the attention deficit seems to drive a willingness to push the truth or ignore it completely if it suits a particular interest.
Well, it gets back to that point I was making about David Shank's work, because there's just so much information. There's abundance of it. In fairness to people, they have a great difficulty wading through it. They have busy lives. They're, taking their kids to hockey practice and, doing their commute and trying to catch up on their sleep. So they have precious little time to pay attention to what political parties are saying to them, what governments are saying to them. And that is the danger. And that's why I think Russia and China knew that about our democracy, is it's much more easy to manipulate these verticals than the horizontal. You just need to get a constituency. Well, in the case of Trump, in 2016, 77,000 voters in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Mm-hmm. That was it. That's all you needed to flip the Electoral College against Hillary. And I was sitting there watching it that night after having worked for her for months, and I almost had a cardiac arrest. I couldn't believe what was happening. 77,000 votes. If people think that those 77,000 American voters did not receive some misinformation and disinformation from professional manipulators, they're dreaming in Technicolor. For sure they did. And unfortunately, the demographics I've seen of that, this gets back to a point you made a while ago. Overwhelmingly, that 77,000 were young people. Mm-hmm. And they just either didn't vote for Hillary or they voted for Trump. And, it was a disaster, obviously, for the world and for the United States.
And, you made the point that, we're less and less this group, and we're more we're more into our own little silos of chunks of people who have their own kind of identities that they want to see spoken to in the political sphere. How about C11? What do you think of this? As far as I understand it, this is Canadian content legislation for streaming services primarily. Yeah. Right. This is Netflix and Prime and Disney, and the mandate that these companies produce a measure of Canadian content in their production before they can be shown in Canada, or at least there's got to be enough content in there. You have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that legislation I have problems with. For example, I've got a website, and I actually set it up. I was some years ago, more than 20 years ago, I was being attacked online by David Irving, the Holocaust denier, and Ernst and so on. And so my friends got in touch with me and said, these guys are going after you all the time. And I said, yeah, what do I do about it? They said, well, you've got to get your own internet presence and push back. And so I did. And, at its peak, I don't know what my numbers are lately. I suspect I've lost a lot to social media, but in election years, I could get 6 million viewers on my website. And so that's one thing I recommend to young people all the time. If you have a passion, you don't necessarily have to give voice to it during a campaign. You can do that with your own website. But that's the problem with C11. The arbiter of how Canadian the content is and how appropriate the content is and so on is the CRTC. The CRTC in 1997 said, we will not regulate the internet. Mm-hmm. I had problems with that vis-a-vis child pornography and Holocaust denier back then, but that was the decision they made. Now they've done a complete 180 and they said, we are going to regulate the internet. And the problem with that is, I say to people all the time, do you know who the head of the CRTC is? Do you know who the assistant deputy ministers are there? So we have these unknown, unaccountable, unelected people who are now going to be deciding about what's appropriate content in many cases, about important political choices. And that too is dangerous. Because mistakes are going to get made, as you pointed out. Humans are flawed. Humans make mistakes, and I anticipate the CRTC is going to make some mistakes. So this is the problem with C11, is we're giving to this unaccountable agency tremendous power over the principal way in which people now communicate with each other and with governments and political parties.
And the original targeting was these rather large companies that I've just mentioned, the big streaming companies. But a lot of the criticism of the bill is precisely it's going to hurt smaller content creators and have a lot of intrusive government oversight over them, and that seems to me that seems to be worrisome. I don't really want them regulating everything that people, there's some things that you clearly want to be watched. You've mentioned two of them. But by and large, I'm a little worried about that.
It is. And it's stupid anyway. There's a reason why it's called the World Wide Web, WWW, because it's global. So like if I get some faceless bureaucrat in the CRTC deciding that, the 6 million people I reach on my website or my Twitter or whatever is inappropriate or inaccurate or whatever, I'm just going to move it to the United States or Liechtenstein or the Grand Caymans. It's like, guys, you can't stop me. It's just stupid. It's not the way the internet works. The internet is like water. I always say this to my young people in my war rooms. The truth is like water. It finds a way out. Always. The truth finds a way out. That's why I think democracy will ultimately prevail. Same thing on the internet. You cannot suppress a story anymore. There's no secrets. I was talking to Prime Minister Chrétien recently about some of this espionage stuff that's been in the media. And he laughed and he said, there's no secrets anymore because of the internet. This stuff leaks out, whether it's Julian Assange or, the guy who's now in Russia or what have you, the stuff comes out. And, which gets back to the point I was making about Trudeau. It's going to come out. So it's, the paradigm has changed. It's shifted in some dramatic ways. And the way in which we're communicating right now is the main reason.
Well, we've seen states that have tried very heavily to suppress, and some with some success, but this is the argument again about China. It's incredibly repressive of an information flow, but it might be a bit brittle in the sense that even they probably have some problems with truth control, and that's in a regime that kind of values it a little bit. One of the things I've noticed, the final area, I forgot about this one, but I wanted to mention this one to you, and I just get your view on it, is polling. One of the things I've noticed is, they aren't that accurate. They don't seem to be that accurate. They seem, people say, well, great example was the Republicans were supposed to win the midterms by get huge numbers of seats. They were winning, and then they did nothing. And no one anticipated through polls what Donald Trump was going to do. And today I read the Liberals yesterday was the Liberals, today it's the Conservatives in Canada. Like, what's going on here with polling? What should we understand about it? How accurate can it be?
Well, over there in the corner, you can't see it. I'm an old-fashioned guy. I've still got a landline, but nobody else does. Everybody's got these. And so pollsters, God bless them, can't reach people anymore. So they've come up with innovations to reach people. They've got internet pools, and they've got what's called IVR, when you pick up the phone and there's somebody, a robotic voice, and press 1 if you're conservative, press 2 if you're liberal, what have you. And so necessarily what that's meant is they're getting stuff wrong now all the time. So what I counsel people to do is do not look at a single poll or even a couple polls. You have to aggregate it. And, the media, those of us in the media will do this for you a lot of the time. Look at a group of polls over a period of time, add them up and divide by the number of pollsters, and then you'll get a reasonable approximation of what's going on. But, a lot of people, because they're into conspiracies or they distrust the media or what have you, are not responding anymore. And so, you've seen this in so many elections where there'll be a hidden vote, whether it's a hidden conservative vote or a liberal vote, and they just show up on voting day and change the outcome. So you really, as you point out, have to take this stuff with a grain of salt. It's because the technology has shifted, and therefore the methodologies have shifted too, and they are getting stuff wrong. I find that makes it more fun. Makes it more fun for guys like me.
Why is that? Why is it more fun when they're wrong?
Well, yeah. Well, no, but because Carville and I were talking about it once, and he said, my political gut has been more accurate than my political brain 10 times out of 10. And that's why, the stuff I said to you earlier about Trudeau miscalculating on China, I don't necessarily have any research to point you to. So my gut tells me he's making a mistake. And the politicians that I've worked for who, kind of operate in a similar way are like Chretien. Like Chretien, I'll tell you a story. Back when Bush was assembling his coalition of the willing, Bush Jr., to take out Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Chretien, he gave me authorization to tell this story. Chretien phoned me one night and he said, what should we do? And I said, I think, Prime Minister, we have to join. Tony Blair in Britain and the Australians and everybody else is joining. And, I'm afraid of what the Americans will do to us if we don't participate. And he said, okay, thank you. And he hung up. And of course, he stood up in the House of Commons subsequently and said, we're not going. And, thunderous applause. And the polling then showed it was one of the most popular things any Canadian prime minister had ever done. So I felt like a horse's ass. I had, egg on my face. So years later, I finally got the guts to say to him, I guess I was the only one of your advisors to say we should go, right? And he looked at me and he said, no. He said, every single one of you said to go. And I said, wait a second. You were the only one who thought it was a mistake? He said, yep. He said, all of you, every single one of you said we should go. And that's, that's experience. That's a political experience. His gut was much more in tune with what Canadians think. And so the politicians that I like working for are the ones who had that populist, and I use that word in its proper context, that populist tendency to understand kind of the zeitgeist of the people. Guys like that are really good at that, and you can learn from candidates like that.
And he took a position as a leader of the country that he's elected to do. A classic example that I've seen that is I read a lot of Abraham Lincoln, and he would do the same thing. He's 17 cabinet members and him, and something controversial in the Civil War. All right, 16 yays, 16 nays, 1 yay. The yays have it. and it would be him. So yeah, it is interesting to see that the polling, you seem to be having two things. One is you got to have a level of emotional toughness in the job that you're in, but you also seem to like it. Like it's fun. Like you've got this sort of happy, this combination of these two things. You're tough, but mean, but also happy. And can you tell me a little bit, where'd that come? Did you acquire it? Were you born that way? Were you?
I think it's learning from guys like him. It's the way I was brought up by my parents. My dad was a professor at Queen's, by the way.
Oh, there we go. What do you teach?
Medicine.
Medicine.
And he was in bioethics later on. He actually ended up as a professor emeritus at Queen's at the end of his life. I think, it's an absurd business. It's crazy. Weird things happen, and you have to laugh at it because you'll go mad if you treat politics with deadly seriousness all the time. Like, for example, this is another thing Carville said to me. He said, you can throw a punch with a very serious look on your face and get in trouble. But he said, you can throw a punch with a smile. You can get away with that a lot more often. And so in the 2000 campaign, some people got mad at me, but I pointed out that Stockwell Day had said that his religious beliefs would inform the decisions he made as a prime minister. As soon as he said that, I knew I had him because he was a creationist. He actually believed that the world was 2,000 years old and that we coexisted with humans, with the dinosaurs. So I went on TV and used humor. It was kind of mean, but I held up Barney the dinosaur and said, this is the only dinosaur that's recently coexisted with humans, Mr. Day, and the Flintstones was not a democracy. So thank God, my conservative opponent, Tim Powers, who's remained a friend, burst out laughing. He couldn't contain it. And so that helped me a lot. But I got back to the campaign office and it was very quiet. People just look at me and I thought, oh, I'm going to get fired. Making the point that I made, and phone rings and it's Mr. Chretien and he says, okay, tell me what happened. And I told him and he's laughing and he says, okay, tell me again. And so it worked. So using humor in politics, because it is such a silly business, does work. There have been instances for me personally where I've used humor and it's blown up in my face. And I talk about that in some of my books. But it's sometimes people want to smile, they want to laugh, they want the absurdity of politics to be pointed out to them. It's not always serious. So I enjoy that part of it. And it's a people business. You got to like people. And I like people. I like partisans. I love their passion, even if I disagree with them. And I like hanging out with them and listening to them talk. And it's important business, but they're also, in the main, in my experience, good people who believe in the country. They've given up on family life and making riches and living at home in order to do something. And, whatever their political ideology is, they tend to be pretty good people. So I enjoy hanging out with them, but not all the time.
Well, you wrote that in a column recently, the importance of making friends across the aisle.
Yeah.
And I read that. Oh, okay. Like, it seems bizarre. You tear at each other during a campaign, and then but it's forgotten, and we got to go on. Like that. I want to give you the chance to reiterate that point publicly because you think it's pretty important that people do that.
Yeah. Well, during campaigns, it is like a hockey game. Chrétien used to say to us, you beat each other silly on the ice, and then you take your jersey off and you go off and have a beer together. And it really is like that. The one thing that's particularly the case in Canada, it used to be the case in the United States before 2016, is, my experience is, and this is not cynicism, it's just a fact. When they get into power, particularly in this country, and it's really just two parties that have gotten into power over the entirety of our country's existence, the differences between them in terms of policy decisions are minuscule. Because what happens is jurisprudence, political precedent, the public service all come to bear on them. And it takes the radicalism out of the equation. And I think that's why Canadian voters in their wisdom have embraced minority governance so many times over the past few years, because they like it. I think they saw, for example, what happened in the United States during the pandemic when you have a lunatic with executive powers. That can be very bad for your country. Whereas here, whether you like Chrétien, Trudeau or not, he didn't have a majority, so he had to do some degree of consultation. The interesting thing, of course, is he's created this confidence and supply agreement with the NDP, which has given him effectively a majority. But, for the most part, when they get into power, there's no significant differences between them.
Which means it allows them to see eye to eye, or at least be moderately polite to each other at the end. We're drawing to the end here a little bit. Let's break away from the politics decision. One of my colleagues noticed this for me, and you have an interesting life outside of your job. Like there's bands and there's music, and can you tell us a little bit about that? And also, it's been my experience that people who have vigorous non-work lives do better in their work lives because of it. gives you a balance. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do outside of work, and then why you do it? Whatever. Yeah, I'm just kind of curious.
I grew up across the country. Also lived in the United States, and my father was a professor and a doc at Queen's and elsewhere. My mother's an artist. And, we were probably, your typical Canadian Irish Catholic, kind of Bobby Kennedy liberals, Democrats in the United States. But I guess I always loved writing. I think if I were to describe myself, I'd describe myself as a writer first. And, I think it was actually music that led me to politics. And I was very involved in the punk rock scene when I was a teenager. That's where I encountered organized racism for the first time. The skinhead movement had flipped and had become pretty racist. The British movement, the National Front, were in their ascendancy in Britain, and it kind of jumped the pond. And a lot of the young guys I knew who were skinheads had become racist. And so I put on rock against racism shows in Calgary and advocated against racism. And in the summer of 1980, it was a problem because the Western separatist movement surged in response to the National Energy Program that Trudeau and Alan McEachern had brought in. And so I looked around, and like the kids who would come to my shows, I would put on shows, and I own my own record company and so on. Some of them just wanted to have a good time. They didn't want to hear me talking about politics. And so I went to I looked at the Conservatives, and they were kind of playing footsie with it. And the New Democrats in Alberta were at least politically irrelevant. And so Liberals really seemed to be the only ones who were countering this separatist, racist, xenophobic stuff. And so that's how I joined the Liberal Party. I went to was wearing a biker's jacket and I went to the Alberta Liberal office, and the leader was a guy named Nick Taylor, later became a senator, wonderful guy. And I think he said to me, "Are you here to rob the place?" And I said, "No, I'm here to join up." And it cost me $2 for my Alberta Liberal card. And, I felt that I had to counter this racism and this xenophobia and this hatred that I was experiencing at my shows. And I had to, getting back to that very first thing we talked about, that accommodation, it was my passion, was opposing that. And I had to find political alignment because I wasn't going to solve it with a rock and roll show. I needed to find a political party that was going to help me do that. And that's how I became involved in the Liberal Party, is because of music.
And you kept that up.
Yeah.
Music all the way through.
Yeah, I'm not very good at it, but it's a lot of fun. Yeah. And, the political people don't understand the politics. The punk rock guys I know don't understand politics. And the political people don't understand the punk rock, but that's okay. It's the thing I did find, there's now a lot of people who are involved in the punk movement. The punk movement really is a political philosophy. It manifests itself in music, certainly, but also in art, in fashion. And then a ton of guys I know who are involved in the punk scene have got involved in politics. So Jello Biafra's run for mayor of San Francisco, is lead singer of the Dead Kennedys. Joey Shithead, who's the leader of the most famous Canadian punk band, DOA, is now a counselor in Burnaby. He's a municipal counselor. It's actually Bobby Kennedy's guys. When I met with them on the way to meeting Bobby before he lost his mind, every single one of his guys was a lawyer, and every single one of them involved in the punk scene in Boston. So I think the political subculture that I come from came from punk rock and the belief that you have to do more to improve the world, and it's just not enough to give up. You've got to try. And so that's why punk rock, I think, is still survives as a subculture, is more than any other musical subculture. It's not just about music, it's about changing the world for the better.
Well, that's not a bad segue into our last question. We have about a few, as long as you want, but it's just basically, not all the viewers of this podcast will be students, but most of them will. And most of them are either young undergrads or MBAs. They're in their 20s, most of them in early 30s. And so what advice would you sort of leave them with, given all we've talked about today, or any other comment about any topic we've talked about today, about young people who might be thinking about, like, I'll give you an example. I sometimes do a little poll in my commerce classes, undergrads. Has anyone considered a public career? I don't get a whole lot of hands.
Mm-hmm.
Now, granted, this is a very select audience, and they went to a business school and all this sort of thing, so but not many of them are considering that, at least not right away. A few are, but not many. So, but it would be nice if maybe a few more did, or at least down the line did. So what would you tell those people, about this thing?
It's what I always say to them, and I kind of referenced this a bit earlier. Listen to the passion, listen to your heart, to sound corny. Like, all of them, however good they are at commerce, have a compelling interest in something that you don't even know about. Maybe they haven't even discovered yet, where they're concerned about racism, or they want to write about art, and they love Tom Thompson.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always say to them, well, then start a website, start a social media platform. They're all free. I mean, Threads started last night. It's free. And start your Tom Thompson website, start your anti-racism platform, give effect to your passion. And the most amazing thing will happen is if you do take it seriously and you add to it every day, and you don't let it drift away, and you spend some time on it, people will start to regard you as an expert. People will start to come to you to ask you for your opinion. And that is the greatest thing of all. You're doing something that you love, that you're passionate about. And some people want to pay you money to give a speech about it or what have you. So and that's what happened to me. I started doing this website. My website generates revenue, and so do my social media platforms. And I'm just saying what I think. I'm trying to be as honest as I can. And it works, because people are looking for honesty these days still. They're looking for somebody who will tell them the truth, or what they consider to be the truth. So that's what I would say to people, is pay attention to your heart, pay attention to your passion, and act on it.
Yeah, and use the act of public life is a mechanism by which you are acting forward these goals that you already have.
And they're all public in public life. I know some of them will say to me, oh, I don't want to be out there like you are. And I say, well, do you have a Facebook account? Do you have a Twitter account? You're out there already. So why not commit yourself to it and do it right? If you oppose, some of the indecent stuff that's on Twitter, and God knows people should, well, then be decent, and be factual and be fair and be balanced, and you will attract an audience for sure. And yes, guys like Donald Trump are also good at attracting an audience too, by saying hateful and terrible and inaccurate things. But, I believe in the end, truth will prevail. It's like water. It comes out. And, that's what they should do. That's what I did, and it worked for me.
Well, it was interesting. I didn't get to this. I guess it's sidetracked towards the end, but traditional versus non-traditional media. You talked about Bobby Kennedy, and, he's spouting some things clearly that are quite different than what most people would typically believe. But he goes on Rogan and he gets 40 million views. And CNN or Fox gets a few 100,000 or a couple of million. So I don't know. I guess that's back to a more technical question, or at least what do you think of that? That these mediums are changing things.
It's dangerous. It relates to what I call my stained glass theory of politics. Because I'm a Catholic, and you sit in a church, and this is true for non-Catholic churches too, and there'll be stained glass on the windows. And I'd say to my kids, the reason why those stained glass are there is because people were illiterate, and they needed to be able to relate the stories, biblical stories, scriptural stories, through these images that were compelling and colorful and so on. And, that's unfortunately what guys like Bobby Kennedy have done. Kennedy's website during the pandemic attracted more clicks than the CDC's. So how does he do that? He does that by simplifying complex matter and telling a story in a passionate way. It's evil and wrong and inaccurate, but it's passionate. And he does it in this simplistic way. So the way I've been talking to you today is, some people say, oh, this Kinsella guy is simplistic and, he writes for a tabloid. Yes, I have consciously decided to write for a tabloid because I believe I show respect for my readers and my listeners by reaching the greatest number of ears and eyes. And I do that by using language that is accessible and understandable. That's respecting people. That's not condescending to people. Like, I know how to write for the Wall Street Journal. I have, but I believe at this time in our history, because of guys like Bobby Kennedy or Donald Trump, it is essential that those of us on the other side push back with a narrative that is understandable and passionate and compelling.